Hey, good morning, Epicenter Church. My name is Ian. I'm the executive. If you were here last week, you know that I am not supposed to be on this stage right now. All right, because Pastor Mark came back last week. We did a round table, and he was gearing up to preach today. He had a sermon ready. He was raring to go, and then his body said, "Nah, bro." He shared last week he had a operation on some kidney stones, and then there were some complications this week, so he went back in for another round of surgery on Friday. They kept him overnight. He's doing well. Recovering seems to be recovering better than last time. Actually, if you hang out with us through the end of the service today, we've got a video announcement from him, kind of sharing some big news. But he's doing good. But continue to pray for him, that he would recover, because he's got a sermon he wants to give you. He's been working on it for a while now, and the plan is for him to be back here on this stage next week and share that message with you. Also, if you were here last week, you know that we technically closed down our series, My Hero, last week. My Hero, we've been doing this for 6 or 7 weeks now. It's a series where we look at different biblical figures that are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith chapter, and we kind of look at stories from their lives. And last week, like I said, we did a round table on the life of Pastor Mark, Pastor Johnny, and myself, and that was the intention. There was to close down the My Hero series, and then Pastor Mark was going to pick up where we left off with another story about Jacob, but in a different series. And so with the complications from his surgery, he and I were talking. We're like, hey, what can we do in the meantime? Let's stay right here with Jacob. A little bit of a prequel to where we were last week and where we're going to be next week. So if you are a person who enjoys movies, you know that prequels are usually worse, so just bear with me, all right? I'm going to do my best. Hopefully that's not the case today, but we're going to look at kind of the origin story of the conflict between brothers, Jacob and Esau, that are mentioned throughout the book of Genesis. And we're going to pick this story up. It starts in verse 25, and we're going to pick it up for now in verse 29, which says in the New Living Translation, one day, man, y'all didn't do it again. Let's try this again. All right. We're going to pick it up in Genesis chapter 25, verse 29. Thank you. Appreciate y'all. All right, it says this in the New Living Translation. One day, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived home from the wilderness, exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, "I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew." This is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. "All right," Jacob replied, "but trade me your rights as the firstborn son." "Look, I'm dying of starvation," said Esau. "What good is my birthright to me now? First you must swear that your birthright is mine." So Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all his rights as a firstborn to his brother Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, then got up and left. He showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. You can have a... So if you have grown up in church, then you've heard this story dozens of times, and so it just makes sense to you because that's just what happens, right? That's the way the story goes, and you know the plot, and you're like, yep, checks out, good. And maybe you've never heard the story before, and you're like, what's a birthright, and why did that dude just trade his for some soup? Makes sense, right? But really, whichever category you kind of fall into, I think there's two things about this passage that are true. First, there's a lot more happening in these 6 verses and even some of the preceding verses that we'll talk about a little bit later than what initially kind of meets the eye. And secondly, we can look at this trade and we can realize without it's an objectively bad deal for one of these parties, right? Like it's whatever a birthright is, it's got to be worth more than some bean soup. And so that's kind of where we can all collectively look at this like that dude definitely sold himself short. He did not win that trade. And when we talk about winning trades, believe it or not, I've been kind of obsessed with winning trades since I was like 10 years old. And it started with basketball cards. All right, my friends and I, we would get basketball cards, and then we would go to the store and we would beg our parents to buy us this magazine. Y'all remember magazines? The 90s were a great time. We would beg our parents to buy us this magazine called Beckett Basketball Monthly. And so, our favorite players would be on the cover, whatever. That's Penny Hardaway, one of my top 3 favorite players of all time. Anyways. And there'd be some pictures, maybe a couple cool articles, but we didn't care about any of that. All right? For us, the reason you had to have Beckett, all right, this is like a catalog, if you will, or like a directory of pretty much any basketball card in production that had any kind of worth or value. And you can look at it. Obviously, you guys can't read these names, but you can come to, like this is 94, 95, Topps Collector's Choice. And you can see all the players, and there's a low right there. And so this is what you use to figure out if you were going to win your trade or not. All right? So as soon as somebody got a new Beckett, because nobody could afford a subscription, and so nobody had every single episode, or not episode, but issue. But as soon as somebody got a new one, we'd be like, hey guys, I got the new one. And then we'd all bring our cards and we kind of lay them out and we'd start trading. Value. You always would try to win the deal. You're like, hey, this card's worth 50 cents. I'll give you this for those two cards that are worth 30 cents each. And you're like, yes, I got some value. I won that deal. You know, if you were trading your friend, their favorite player, you could probably get a little bit better value. Like I could trade a $5 Jordan card for a $3 Penny Hardaway and a $3 Grant Hill. And I'm like, I won that trade, even though the Michael Jordan cards kind of held their value a little bit better. But anyways, and then you had to be careful because every once in a while, maybe not the inner circle, but if there was somebody, was only around sometimes, somebody might like, hey, I'll trade you for that rookie card of this guy who's really having a breakout season. And you'd be like, hold on a second, let me see how old your issue of Beckett is. And it'd be like 6, 7 months old. And they'd be like, trying to trade you based on old value before this guy you got popular. So there's proof that there were nerds. Anyways, but this obsession with winning a trade did not stop with Beckett magazine. You can take that off the screen. Every time we go to buy a car, I spend hours, if not days, like doing all the research, right, and crunching all the numbers and like, okay, this to pay for this vehicle, and I'm not going to go over this amount of months financing, and I'm never going to accept less than or more than this kind of interest rate, and I'm ready, and I'm going to march in to the car dealership, and that works really, really well as long as you don't bring your wife with you. I've done all that research every time I've deal because she always wants to come. Anyways. And like the salesmen know that, right? Like they're I don't know. I feel like they're trained to like, they only ever talk to her. Like, oh, look, this. And like, it's not in my notes. Even now, right? Like if there's a pair of 15 different websites to make sure nobody has it cheaper than everybody else. Because I'm not going to pay more than what I have to. I'm not going to lose out on a deal. And, I think most of us kind of inherently feel that way. Like it's kind of ingrained within us that we want to win. We want to come out on top when it comes to making trades. And that's pretty important because when we kind of take a step back and look at it, a lot of our lives in society is built on trading. We don't always call it trades, but that's what it is, right? We trade or exchange one thing and receive something else. We trade our effort and expertise at work. We get money. Right? And then we trade that money for food and clothes and experiences and whatever other stuff we can afford. If you're in school, then you trade your time and your energy for an education. At the gym, you trade your blood, sweat, and tears for weight loss and muscle gain, hopefully. If you're a child, you trade obedience for privileges. If you're a parent, you trade privileges for obedience. If you have a pet, you trade treats and cuddles and belly rubs for not having to clean up messes all the time. This also is true if you have a 4-year-old. But we trade other stuff too, right? Like we trade our time and our talents and our finances to invest in something we believe in. Anytime, speaking of Your It Month, anytime you invest in Epicenter Church, that's a trade. It's not a trade you have to make, but it's a trade that many of you do. And you say, this matters, this is important to me. There's enough value here that I'm going to trade what I have in order for the long-term rewards. Commitment to our partners in order for a healthy relationship. We trade honesty for trust. We trade our time for likes on social media. We trade our sense of individuality and being the unique person God created us to be in order to trade it for conformity, right? We trade sometimes our God-given command to stand out and be a light in the world in order to fit in. Sometimes some people, they trade they just, man, we just make trades and we make compromises and we make sacrifices and always want to come out on top, but sometimes we feel like we don't really have any other choice, and so we make the deal anyways. Even the decisions that we don't make are a type of trade, as the economic principle of opportunity cost applies to life choices as well as economics. Every time we choose to do one thing, we're trading the opportunity to do anything else in that moment. We're trading the opportunity to choose any other path, right? And the real world does not work like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where every decision spawns a whole new whatever. My son could tell you all about that. But every decision, every choice, every trade we make represents, as the great philosopher Marshall Mathers said, one shot. See, I knew the second service would get that joke better than the first service. One shot, one opportunity, right? The problem is, with all this trading, that we all assign value in different ways, and there is no Beckett magazine for life choices. We can't consult a valuation decide if the relationship is worth investing in, or to weigh the cost of passing on this job in hopes of getting a better one, or to help decide if a decision is worth the potential consequences. So if we're not careful, we can find ourselves trading long-term value for short-term pleasure. If our priorities are out of whack, we're not seeking God's wisdom or asking Him to guide our paths, we may end up getting ripped off in some pretty significant ways when it comes to what we trade our time, talents, energy, and passion for. There's a spiritual element to the spiritual component, rather, to the many trades that we make. It can be easier than we might think to overlook the value of what we're trading, and that's why it's so important to invite God into this process. Right? Too often we just make trades based on whatever makes sense to us, and we don't think of it really as trading much of anything. But Proverbs 3:5-7 says this, says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek His will in all you do, and He will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. What the author of that proverb is saying is that God is better than a Beckett magazine, right? Beyond just approximate value, He offers divine wisdom and direction. And we don't have to go to the store and hope we can get the latest issue. We can go straight to Him and say, hey man, I need some help. I need some wisdom. I need some guidance. I need some direction. We have that opportunity, and yet, how often do we depend on our own understanding or become impressed with our own wisdom, trading the chance to trust in the Lord and seek His will for impulsivity, selfishness, or a quick fix? And all this talk about trading is why I think the story of Jacob and Esau is so important, because there are a lot more trades happening in this narrative than meets the eye. It's more than just a birthright for some soup. Esau and Jacob were born to Isaac, the only son of Abraham and Sarah, and his wife Rebekah, after 20 years of trying to conceive. You know, I read something this week that says it's only an oxymoron that barrenness runs in the family when God is not involved. You know, but if you know the story, Abraham and Sarah had to wait 25 years before Isaac was born, and now Isaac and Rebekah have to wait 20 years for their twins to be born. But verse 22 tells us that the two boys struggled with one another while they were still in their mother's womb, so much that Rebekah was like, hey, God, if this is going to be the way it's going to be, why do I live? Like, I can't live with this. Like, what is up? So she goes to God and she asks, why is this happening to me? And God answered her by saying, the sons in your womb will become two rival nations, or two nations. From the beginning, rival. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. So essentially, what God is doing is He's promising Rebekah that her younger son would one day be the one that would carry out the covenant that God made with Abraham. He would bear all the rights and responsibilities. God and the ultimate Redeemer of the world would come from his line. And it's important to note that God is not, in this statement, He's not rejecting one son and choosing the other. He's not saying, I approve of this son and disapprove of the other, because these children haven't even been born yet. He's simply making a proclamation of what is going to come to pass. If we remember that Genesis is a narrative. It's an explanation of God establishing his covenant people. And Genesis was written to an original audience. And so throughout the book of Genesis, God has this habit, right, of bucking the societal and cultural status quo and choosing the younger or weaker sons to carry out his plans for his chosen people. What would make sense in society is, whoever the firstborn son is, that's who gets the stuff, that's who carries out the line, that's who does all the stuff. But God's like, I got a different idea. The reason for this is because God wants to remind his audience that he is the one who brings blessing to his people, not the patriarchs and forefathers. Matter of fact, a lot of times the good things of God often happen in spite of those men, not because of them. And then verse 24 continues the story and it says, and when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red with thick hair like a fur coat. So they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. That's crazy to me. Because my youngest son was born when I was not quite 35. I barely could handle it. So, 60 years old, man. No, thank you. But anyways, I told it first service, I wish we had some more time today to dive into the meaning of these names because there's a lot of really cool depth there, with the names that these parents chose for their children. But we'll save that for another day. Verse 27 and 28 continues. It says, as the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so again, there's probably a message in here somewhere about the danger of playing favorites as parents, right? And giving different privileges to different kids and treating them. Obviously each kid is different, so they got to be parented differently, but you understand what I'm saying. Anyways, I took 20 seconds to say we don't have time to cover that today. Makes sense when you're... Anyways, it's safe to say, though, I think, that between the pre-birth promises that God spoke over Rebekah's children and the post-birth preferences that both Isaac and Rebekah are demonstrating for their sons, there's some significant tension in this household, right? Like there's more than just regular old sibling rivalry. There's just this highly competitive nature, competing for affection, competing for a promise, competing for a birthright, especially when you factor in the fact that these guys were born just a couple minutes apart. And so there's this intense kind of tension and competition within their house. And that's where we find ourselves in verse 29, where the major trait of this narrative begins to take shape between Jacob and Esau. And we begin to see the importance of paying attention to the trades we make in life and the value that we place on things. It says, one day, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived home from the wilderness, exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew. Esau comes barging into this tent, right? It's a long day of hunting. He's been out there, kind of scouring the land, trying to find some animals to bring home for dinner. He comes home and he's tired. He's so tired and hungry, in fact, that another translation of verse 30 reads, please let me have a mouthful of that red stuff there, for I am exhausted. He's so tired and hungry, he can't even bother to remember the name soup. Just like, give me some of that red stuff. But where Esau really finds himself in this moment is a place of weakness. He may not seem like that because he's like, I know what I want. I know what I want. I want that red stuff there, and I know when I want it, which is right now. Culture will tell us that that's a strength, and sometimes it can be. I'm not saying it's always a bad thing to know what you want. But sometimes, right, they'll say, hey, as long as you know what you want, you go get it. There never is any kind of direction to like, hey, as long as you know what you want and have consulted God's wisdom and made sure it's the right thing for you, then you go get it. Too often we skip that step, and that's where Esau's at right now. He don't bother to wonder or check or even think about, hey, does this make sense for me? He's like, nah, I want some of that red stuff, and I want it now. He wants it so badly, in fact, that he don't really care all that much how he gets it. He's placed such a high level of value on the instant gratification of his immediate desires that he's willing to trade anything. And this, my friends, is how sin works. when we value what we want right now over anything and everything else, when we can't see value past this moment, we begin to make lopsided trades. We begin to mortgage our future for what we want right now. As Esau finds himself in a position where at this exact moment, nothing is more valuable to him than that red stuff. He's traded living in the moment for living for the moment, because nothing is more important in his eyes than whatever he wants right now. Living in the moment is a great way to live. It's what Jesus commands us to do. Jesus says, hey, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow's got enough worries. Be where you're at. Be present in the moment. Be opportunities to serve others and to invest in them. Living in the moment is something we should all strive to do, because it's so easy to get distracted with worries about tomorrow and next week and next month. That's a great thing. But what Esau's doing here is he's living for the moment, right? He's not living just in the moment, he's living for the moment. That means that nothing else matters right now. What I want, what I think, how I feel in this moment is the only important thing. Who cares about how this decision might affect my future, or even how similar decisions may have affected me in the past? This is what I want to do, where I want to be, how I want to live, and I don't really care about anyone or anything else. And sin tries to trade what's right for what we want right now, to trade our purpose in life for a moment of pleasure, to trade faithfulness to God for a fleeting moment of gratification, to trade living in the moment for living for the moment. And ultimately, it's a case of misplaced value and disordered priorities. Whether it's sin or soup, if we're not watching closely, we'll make trades that don't seem like a big deal right now, but have major ramifications for us later. Proverbs 4:23 says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. We have got to pay attention to what is most important to us, to what we love and desire most, because that is what steers the direction that our lives go in. And what I'm talking about here is not just what we say is most important, because if I was to come down these steps and put a microphone in the face of any one of you right now, you all know the right answer, right? If I was to come and say, hey, what's most important to you? Something about God or your faith or your family or your wife, if she's sitting right next to you, you're definitely going to say that first. But you know the right answers. We all do. But this is not what we're talking about. I'm not asking you what you say or even what you think is most important, but what our thoughts and actions reveal as being most important to us. Here's what I mean. If you had gone to Esau the day before this story happened and asked him, hey, you big red fella, what's the most important thing in the world to you? He's not going to answer a bowl of soup. I can't imagine anyone giving that answer except for maybe like the CEO of something. All right? He's not going to say, hey, the most important thing in the world to me is a bowl of soup. But the very next day, what his actions reveal is the most important thing to him is exactly that. Right? We've got to pay attention. It's not just sin that does this, although sin does it all the time, right? We know, we say, hey, I want this. I want to be more like Christ. I want to grow deeper in my faith. But what we think about, care about, pay attention to, invest our time in is something very different. And then we'll look up 6 months later and we're over here when we're trying to be over there. Because what our heart wants, what we love the most, is what determines the direction that our lives take. And again, it's not just sin that does this. We can become so driven by our careers, our dreams, and our plans that we unintentionally deprioritize our families, our relationships, and our faith. If you ask us, we're going to tell you that the last three things are more important. Of course, I love my family and my faith, and my relationships are much more valuable than any of those other things. But if you look at our lives, you're going to see that we're showing you with our actions sometimes tells a different story. So we have to guard our hearts and be careful what we love. Not what we think we love, but what our hearts and actions and thoughts are proclaiming to the world around us that we value most. And so Esau finds himself in a situation where nothing matters except for what he wants right now. He's traded living in the moment for living for the moment, and now he's willing to trade anything, even everything, to get what he wants. And so Jacob's like, ooh, it's a good opportunity for me. And he jumps in verse 31 and says, all right, I'll give you some red stuff, but trade me your birthright as the firstborn. Trade me your rights as the firstborn son. Listen, every other time I've ever read the story, I thought that this was Jacob taking everything from Esau. I thought that this was, birthright, the spiritual birthright, the covenant blessing, all of it. Only this week, as I've studied this, have I learned that those are actually three separate things. If you know the story of Jacob and Esau, you know that in 2 chapters later, Jacob's going to straight out steal Esau's paternal blessing. And then a couple chapters that Isaac gives Jacob the covenantal blessing. But in this moment, all that Jacob's trying to get is stuff. He's saying, man, listen, I know how this works. In the ancient Near East culture, the firstborn gets a double portion of everything. If there's 9 sons, then everything that the father owns is divided 10 ways. Gets 20%. If there's 3 sons, then everything the father owns gets divided 3 ways, and the firstborn gets 66.6666666%. And if you think about this, man, if you think about being Jacob, like, hold on a second, bro. I literally was born like 30 seconds after you. Why do you get all that stuff? Like, it don't make sense. It's not fair, but that's the way of doing things. And so Jacob is kind of seizing the moment here, and he's just asking for stuff. That's it. I want that extra 33%. I want that to be mine instead of yours. That's the deal. He's just asking for material possession. In verse 32, Esau responds by saying, look, I'm dying of starvation. What good is my birthright to me now? So like I just said, the birthright in question is literally just stuff, right? It's just a share or a portion of their inheritance. But in this honor and shame culture, that's still, there's a ton of societal and cultural significance. There's honor in being the firstborn. There's honor in being the recipient of that double portion. You know, there's a responsibility there. It's something that kind of is one of the pillars of their culture and their community. And so the original audience of this narrative would have been horrified to hear Esau say, what good is my birthright to me? But again, he can't see past the moment. He's hungry, he's tired, and he really, really, really wants that red stuff. And his brother made him an offer. But when he utters this phrase, what good is my birthright to me now, he's revealing a mindset that a lot of us struggle with too. The obstacle in front of him, in this case, intense hunger, right? It seems so great that it can never be overcome without one specific outcome. So what good is his future to him if he can't have the thing that he wants, if he can't solve the problem that's directly in his way? He's giving up value in a trade because he can't see past where he is right now. And in that sense, many of us can identify with Esau on at least some level, because we make bad trades because of the intensity of the situation we find ourselves in, if it feels too great to overcome. You know, we say things like, look, my marriage is falling apart. What good is it to me now? You know, I've been diagnosed with cancer. What good is prayer or trust to me now? I'm struggling with depression. What good is hope to me now? Look at all the obstacles I'm facing. What good is it to trust in God now? Don't you understand what I'm dealing with? And I'm not here to, listen, I've been in those places. Maybe not any of those specific examples, but I've been in those places where whatever's staring at me in the faces makes me feel like, man, what good is anything else to me now? I get it. All right, I'm not here to condemn or judge anybody who's felt that way, because I've been there. But what I'm trying to say is, when we can't see value in our purpose, our calling, or ourselves, we're going to keep making bad trade after bad trade, and we're going to fall further and further into hopelessness until we reach a point that feels like there is no return. We're going to become willing to sacrifice the future because we can't see past the present. And that's not what God has for us. We have to remember that there is future value in our present condition, because God says he will work all things together for the good of those who love him. Jacob says in verse 33, first, the birthright is mine. So Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all his rights as the firstborn to his brother Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, then got up and left. He showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. Your translation might say he despised his birthright. But in either instance, it's not talking about how he felt about his birthright, but how much he valued it. It's another way of saying he was careless with his birthright. He devalued his birthright because he couldn't see past the present moment. As a hunter, he's a pretty utilitarian guy, right? So he had no use for something. If he had no use for something right now, it was hard to see it ever being useful. And the same thing happens to us when we lose sight of the future value of living for Jesus right now. When we lose sight of, man, if we hold on to faith now, if we have endurance right now, then good things are going to come to us. As people who have been given the opportunity to be adopted into the family of Christ, we have a spiritual birthright of our own. It comes with complete acceptance by God, redemption from our sin, true and total forgiveness, the riches of God's grace, and so much more. And yet we show contempt for this birthright when we fail to acknowledge its value by living carelessly. Man, we are careless with our birthright when we trade our worth in Christ for the lie that our sin and struggles have made us worthless. We despise our birthright when we believe that our shame is too great for God to forgive us. We show contempt for our birthright when we trade the purpose and plan for which we were created that will never be good enough, that will never measure up. We're careless with our birthright when we continually trade what is right for what we want right now, when we trade the standard God calls us to for momentary pleasure, and when we trade the chance to be used by God for living for the moment. Man, and the reality of Esau's trade is it was irreversible. He swore an oath, and in that culture, you swear an oath, it's over. It's done. It all belongs to Jacob. 2 chapters later, Jacob sneaks in and he steals Esau's paternal blessing and about dressing up as his brother with goat hair. That's a really hairy dude. And lying to his father. And Esau comes in and like, hey, Father, where's my blessing? He's like, oh, bro, your brother just stole it. I'm so sorry. And he crying tears. He's like, man, you don't got anything else for me? And it's this realization that he had showed contempt for his birthright long ago. And there's no going back, right? And some of us have made decisions, we've made trades that we're gonna have to deal with the ramifications of that for maybe the rest of our lives. But I need you to understand something. There's no trade that you've ever made or could make that makes you irredeemable, right? There's no trade or exchange that you could ever engage in that God can't work together for your good. And I'm just gonna tell y'all something. I know what time it is, and I feel like I'm talking really fast already, but I'm gonna speed up even more, all right? Because I got a lot more notes here, and there's some stuff I need you to hear, and I'm trying to get you out of here on time. So just bear with me for just a moment if you would, okay? Because everything we've talked about so far, that's only one side of the coin. All right, Esau wasn't a bad trade that day. I want you to understand this. We're gonna go back and look at a couple things from Jacob. Verse 31 shows us that Jacob, when he saw his brother in a moment of weakness, he viewed it not as a chance to show his brother love and mercy, but as an opportunity to take advantage of him. All right, Jacob replied, but trade me your rights as the firstborn son. He saw how desperate Esau was for some red stuff, and he decided to manipulate his brother into surrendering his most valuable possession. And in this moment, Jacob made a transaction that many of us make all the time. He traded the chance to trust in God's promises over his life for the opportunity to take matters into his own hands. He traded God's promise for his plans. The thing is, if God's promised us something, we should trust that it will come true in his time, not try to make it happen in our own time. But that's not what we always do. I can't count the number of times that I personally have tried to rush God's promises, things done myself, and I always end up making it worse instead of better. You know, when we trade God's promise for our own plans, we will always make things worse than they were supposed to be. In both this chapter and 2 chapters later, Jacob ended up getting what God had promised, but not in the way that it was intended. If you read through the book of Genesis, you're going to see that as a result of Jacob's dishonesty and deception, he had to flee from his home. He had to never see his mother again, and he spent a large portion of his life wondering if today would be the day that his brother came to kill him. When we rush things or try to take them into our own hands to work our own plan, and does use those situations for our good, and he still gets us to where we were ultimately supposed to go, but there's often a lot more twists and turns than expected and an element of struggle that we were never meant to experience. It's what happens when we trade God's promise for our own plans, but that's not the only trade that Jacob made that day. When he chose to retain through manipulation and deceit something God already said was his, he traded surrender for self-righteousness. He went from seeing God's promise as a blessing and a gift to seeing it as something that he deserved, something that was rightfully his. You know, this is this is something that almost everyone here has done at least once in our lives. We've made this trade before, and almost never on purpose, right? Because what happens is when we first surrender our lives to Christ, we're so thankful for all that he's done for us. We're humbled by his love and his grace. We're like, man, God, I know who I used to be, and I'm so thankful for loving me anyways, in spite of that. But over time, as we start getting further and further away from who we used to be, right, and we start doing the right thing, we go to church more, we cuss our neighbors out less, we're generally, I didn't say none, by the way, just less, we're just better people, right? We start to deceive ourselves into thinking that we deserve to. That we're better people than those who have not yet decided to follow Jesus. We trade our initial surrender for self-righteousness. And once we've done this, it can be easy to justify all kinds of actions and behaviors that are outside of God's will for our lives, because after all, we're good people and we deserve to have what we want. For a bad deal when we trade seeing God's provision as a blessing, when we trade that for seeing it as something that we deserve. Because when we live this way, when we allow ourselves to be convinced that we are somehow better or more deserving of God's love and grace because we sin less, or at least less publicly, not yet surrendered to him, when we trade God's promise for our own plans and our surrender for self-righteousness, we're forgetting the core message of the gospel of Jesus. And again, I want you to go back and put yourself in the shoes of the original audience of the book of Genesis. These are people who are from the line of Abraham. They're reading the history of their family. And they know that because Isaac only has 2 sons, one of these guys has to be the one through whom the covenant continues. And if you're reading this, you're like, can we get a 3rd son? Like, both of these guys, no good options here. Okay? We got this one guy who is so impulsive and just doesn't think about anything, and he traded his birthright for a bowl of soup when there was literally bread sitting right on the table. I didn't mention that to you, by the way, but go back and read it. You're going to see there was bread there the whole time. Anyways, and then we got this other guy who's so deceitful and conniving, and he straight up lied to his dad. And I would rather not be a descendant of either one of these people. That's kind of the picture that the author is painting. He's like, listen, this is where we came from. This is who God chose to use to bring redemption to the world. And he did it for a reason. If you look throughout history, throughout the entire line from Abraham to the Messiah, it's filled with broken, messed up people who constantly trade God's promises for their own plan, who constantly trade surrender for self-righteousness, who constantly trade doing God's will for whatever they want to do right now. It's people who never seem to make the right decision, and yet God says, this is who I've chosen to bring about redemption and restoration for the world that I've created. And I've done it for this reason, so that nobody can ever say that it had anything to do with anybody but me. That's the first reason. By me, I mean God, because I'm quoting him there. And secondly, so that nobody can ever say that they're outside of my grace. Nobody can ever say that I can't use them. Paul wrote in Romans 3:23, he wrote, we all fall short of God's glorious standard. But then in verse 24, he said, yet God, in his grace, freely makes us right in his sight. He expands on this concept, Paul does in Ephesians 2:8-9, when he writes, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. Salvation is not a reward for the good things you have done, so none of us can boast about it. This is the beauty of the gospel. No matter how many times we've traded our own desires for doing what God has called us to do, no matter how much we've sacrificed for God's plan and his will, that doesn't make us any more deserving of his grace than anybody else. No matter how many times we've traded God's will for our own selfish, sinful desires, we are still not disqualified from his grace. God will trade our brokenness for his redemption. He'll trade our chaos for his peace. He'll trade our sin for his grace, our death for his life. Not because of who we are or the choices or trades that we've made that make us seem a little bit more worthy, but in spite of those things, God chooses weak and broken people to bring about his plan for redemption, to remind us where our strength comes from, and to prove that his power is available to anyone who seeks him. God made the most lopsided trade in history just for us. Worship team, you should be back by now. He traded the innocent life of his son Jesus for all of our sin and death. He traded life for death and then overcame death by raising again 3 days later. Because of that, we have direct access to the throne room of the creator of the universe. And we can go there and make all kinds of lopsided trades. We can trade our worry for his peace. We can trade our weakness for his strength. We can trade our past and our problems for his plan, his purpose, and his promise. We can trade condemnation for his grace. We can trade desperation for his hope. We can trade our old life for the new life that is found only in him. Because he traded death for life, life for death, we can trade death for life. In the birthright of Jesus without qualification or condition. Church, we have been offered the greatest trade in history. Esau wasn't worthy, but neither was Jacob. You may not feel worthy, but neither am I. That's the beauty of the gospel, because the trade is your junk for my beauty. Your sin for my salvation. Your redemption. I just had this thought that God's like the worst pawn shop owner ever. Because you can bring him literally anything and he'll take it. And he won't just take it, he'll give you the exact same value he gave the other guy who came in with a 14-karat diamond ring. It's not good for business, but it's great for us.